The first time I dug up a buried scrap of cardboard in the middle of July, I actually sat back on my heels in the dirt and laughed out loud. I had pushed a flattened pizza box, soaked and softening, about 4 inches under the soil at the edge of a tomato bed 6 weeks earlier, mostly as an experiment, half expecting to forget about it entirely. The morning I went back and slid my fork under that patch and lifted, the whole underside of the cardboard came up dark and slick, and absolutely seething with worms. Not a few, not a dozen, but hundreds in 1 square foot in a part of the garden that 2 months earlier had been so hard and pale and lifeless that the fork bounced off it. The soil underneath was crumbly and dark and smelled like a forest floor after rain. That rich, sweet, earthy smell that you only get from living soil. And 6 weeks before, there had been almost nothing alive there at all. I had not added a single worm. I had not bought anything. I had buried a piece of garbage in the dirt, and the worms had come by the thousand on their own, summoned by something I did not yet understand. And once I understood it, I stopped buying soil amendments almost entirely because the worms, it turned out, would build my soil for free, faster and better than any bag I could carry home if I simply learned to feed them. And feeding them in the heat of July is the single highest leverage thing a gardener can do for next year's harvest. Here is the thing almost nobody tells you about garden worms. You do not import them. You do not stock them like fish in a pond. The earthworms that build garden soil, the common night crawlers and the smaller red worms that churn your topsoil, are almost always already present in your garden or in the soil immediately around it in numbers far larger than you would ever guess. They are simply hiding. In the heat and dryness of midsummer, the worm population in the top several inches of bare, exposed, sun-baked soil collapses. The worms do not die in most cases. They retreat, they burrow down, sometimes several feet into the cooler, moist subsoil, curl into a knot, coat themselves in slime, and enter a dormant state called estivation, waiting out the heat the way a bear waits out winter. Your bare summer beds look wormless not because there are no worms, but because you have made the surface uninhabitable for them. Too hot, too dry, too exposed, and they have gone deep and gone quiet. The entire trick of attracting thousands of worms in July is not summoning them from somewhere far away. It is creating in the middle of the hottest, driest part of the year, one cool, dark, moist, food-rich pocket in your soil that says to every worm within reach, come back up. It is safe here and there is food. Bury the right thing in July and you are not planting worms. You are ringing a dinner bell that the worms already in your garden cannot resist. So let us talk about what you actually bury, because there is a hierarchy, and getting it right is the difference between a patch crawling with life in 6 weeks and a patch that does nothing. The simplest, and in many ways the best thing to bury, is plain corrugated cardboard. Brown shipping boxes, the pizza box, the cereal carton, torn into flat pieces and stripped of any glossy printing or plastic tape. Cardboard works for a beautifully simple reason. Worms do not actually eat soil for nutrition, and they do not eat fresh green leaves either. What earthworms eat is decomposing organic matter and the bacteria and fungi growing on it. And corrugated cardboard is one of the most worm-attracting materials on Earth because the corrugation itself, those little tunnels of air between the layers, creates the exact dark, humid, sheltered microclimate worms crave. While the cardboard fiber, which is just processed wood, slowly softens and grows a film of fungi that the worms graze on. The glue used in corrugated cardboard is typically a plant-based starch, and worms are positively fond of it. You soak a few flattened pieces in a bucket of water until they are limp. Lay them flat on the soil surface, or just under an inch of soil, and within 2 to 3 weeks the underside is a worm metropolis. In July, with everything else baking, that damp, dark cardboard layer becomes the coolest, safest real estate in the garden, and the worms move in en masse. The next tier up, and the one that turns a worm gathering into an actual soil building engine, is buried kitchen scraps. This is where you stop merely sheltering worms and start genuinely feeding and breeding them, because food does not just attract worms, it lets them reproduce. The technique is sometimes called trench composting or pit composting, and in July it is almost magical in its speed. You dig a trench or a hole somewhere, in or beside a bed roughly 8 to 12 inches deep, and you bury your kitchen scraps directly in the ground. Then cover them back over with the soil you removed. Vegetable peelings, fruit cores, coffee grounds in the paper filter, crushed eggshells, spent tea leaves, soft trimmings. The things you would normally put in a compost bin. You bury them deep enough that they are below the hot, dry surface zone, surrounded by moist soil and insulated from the sun. And the warmth of July accelerates their breakdown dramatically. Within days, the buried scraps begin to soften and ferment and grow the bacterial and fungal films that worms feed on. And the worms, sensing the chemical signals of decomposition through the soil, converge on the buried food from every direction. They eat the softening scraps. They eat the microbes. And crucially, well-fed worms breed. A worm with abundant food in a cool, moist environment will lay cocoons, and each cocoon hatches several baby worms. So a buried scrap trench does not just gather the worms you have, it multiplies them. Keep the scraps below the surface and covered. Avoid meat, dairy, oils, and large amounts of citrus or onion, which can repel worms or attract pests. And rotate the trench to a new spot every few weeks, so you are steadily seeding worm activity across the whole bed. If you want something that lasts beyond a single feeding and keeps a worm colony anchored in one spot all season, you build what people call a worm tower, and it is the most elegant version of this whole idea. A worm tower is nothing more than a length of pipe or a bottomless bucket with holes drilled all over its lower half, sunk vertically into the soil so that the whole section is buried and a few inches stick up above ground with a lid on top. You fill the buried perforated chamber with kitchen scraps and a little shredded cardboard or dry leaves. Put the lid on and walk away. The worms move in and out through the drilled holes, entering the tower to feed, then traveling back out into the surrounding soil, dragging worm castings and nutrients with them, fertilizing the bed from the inside in a slow, continuous outward radiation. Because the food is below ground and the tower is shaded and moist, it stays hospitable even in a heat wave. And because you can keep topping it up with scraps through the summer, it becomes a permanent worm staging post that conditions the soil for a yard in every direction. Tuck one into the middle of a bed of heavy feeders, your squash or your tomatoes, top it up weekly, and the worms will deliver castings straight to the root zone of the very plants you most want to feed all season, with no digging and no turning. The two materials that work more slowly but build the most durable, long-lasting soil structure are wood chips and aged manure. And they belong in any serious worm strategy because they feed the part of the soil food web that worms depend on. Wood chips, arborist chips ideally, the rough mix of chipped branches and leaves you can often get free from a tree company, do not attract worms instantly the way cardboard or scraps do because fresh wood is slow to break down, and the worms cannot eat it until fungi have begun to digest it first. But that is exactly the point. A thick layer of wood chips laid on the soil surface, not dug in but laid on top as a mulch, keeps the soil beneath it cool and permanently moist through the worst of summer, and as the bottom layer of chips meets the soil, it grows a dense white web of fungal threads, and that fungal layer is a worm feast. Worms come up under wood chip mulch and graze the rich fungal interface in enormous numbers, and over a season they pull the partly decomposed material down into the soil, building the deep, dark, fungal-dominated topsoil that perennial plants and fruit trees love. Aged manure, the well-rotted droppings of horses, cows, chickens, or rabbits that have sat and composted until it no longer smells, works similarly but faster because it is already rich in the bacteria, partially digested plant matter, and nutrients that worms devour. A layer of aged manure dug shallowly into a bed in July, kept moist and shaded, will be threaded with worms within a couple of weeks and will leave the soil dramatically richer for next spring. Never use fresh manure in a growing bed as it is too strong and can burn roots and even harm the worms. But aged, crumbly, earthy manure is one of the finest worm foods there is. It helps to understand that not all worms in your garden are the same because they do different jobs and your buried food strategy feeds them in different ways. And knowing this lets you build a complete worm workforce rather than just attracting one kind. Broadly, there are three groups of earthworms living in garden soil. The first are the surface dwellers, the small reddish worms, the same family as the composting red wigglers, which live in the top inch or two of soil and in leaf litter and surface organic matter, and which breed explosively when there is a constant supply of decomposing food on the surface. These are the worms your cardboard, your surface scraps, and your wood chip mulch feed directly, and they are the fast multipliers, the ones whose population can explode in a few weeks under a damp sheet of cardboard. The second group are the topsoil dwellers, the medium worms that live and tunnel horizontally through the upper soil, eating their way through the earth and the organic matter mixed into it. And these are your great soil mixers, blending your buried scraps and manure down into the body of the bed and threading it with castings. The third group are the deep burrowers, the large night crawlers that dig permanent vertical tunnels several feet down and come to the surface at night to pull leaves and organic matter down into their burrows. These are the worms that retreat deepest in the July heat, and they're exactly the ones your cool, moist, food-rich, buried pockets coax back up. And their deep vertical channels are priceless for drainage and aeration. A garden that feeds all three, surface food for the wigglers, mixed-in food for the topsoil worms, and a cool, moist surface for the deep burrowers to come up under, becomes a fully staffed underground operation with worms working at every depth from the leaf litter to 3 feet down. Now, because plenty of gardeners try this and get disappointing results, let me tell you the handful of mistakes that cause failure so you can avoid all of them. The first and by far the most common mistake is letting it dry out. Moisture is the one absolutely non-negotiable condition because a worm breathes through its skin, and that skin must stay moist or the worm will retreat or die. So a buried scrap or cardboard pile that bakes dry in a July heat wave will attract nothing at all. If you do only one thing right, keep it damp. The second mistake is bearing the wrong materials. Worms are repelled by meat, dairy, fats, and oils, and large amounts of citrus, onion, garlic, and anything salty or heavily spiced. And these things also attract rats and flies and stink as they rot. So keep your buried scraps to vegetable and fruit waste, coffee, tea, eggshells, and soft trimmings. The third mistake is burying too shallow in the heat, leaving your food or cardboard right at the baking surface with no insulating cover where it dries and cooks instead of fermenting in cool, moist darkness, which is why the mulch layer over the top matters so much. The fourth mistake is impatience. Digging up your cardboard after 1 week to check and disturbing the colony, just as it is establishing when the real exposure happens between weeks 3 and 6. So, cover it and leave it alone. And the fifth mistake is expecting worms to thrive in soil drenched in synthetic fertilizers and pesticides because harsh chemical fertilizers and many garden chemicals are toxic or repellent to worms. So the worm-friendly garden is necessarily a more natural, organically fed garden. Avoid those 5 mistakes, keep it moist, bury the right food deep enough, cover it, and wait, and the worms will come every single time. Now, I want to take you underground for a moment because understanding why this works is what turns it from a trick into a practice you will never abandon. And it all comes down to a thing called the soil food web. Healthy living soil is not dirt. It is a teeming, interconnected community of organisms. Billions of them in a single handful, arranged in a web of who eats whom. At the base of that web are bacteria and fungi, the primary decomposers, which break down organic matter, the dead leaves and roots and scraps into forms that can be used. Feeding on those bacteria and fungi are the next tier, the protozoa, the nematodes, the microscopic grazers, and moving through all of it, eating the organic matter and the microbes and aerating the whole structure, are the larger creatures, the springtails, the mites, and above all the earthworms, which are the great engineers of this entire system. When you bury organic matter in July, you are not just feeding worms, you are igniting the whole food web. The buried cardboard or scraps explode with bacterial and fungal growth. The microbe grazers multiply to feast on that bloom, and the worms move in to eat both the organic matter and the microbes. And as they do, they perform the work that makes soil fertile. A worm eats its way through the soil, and what passes out the other end, the worm cast, is a small miracle of fertility. Worm castings are richer than the soil that went in, several times richer in available nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and calcium, because the worm's gut concentrates nutrients and seeds them with beneficial microbes and binds them into stable crumbs. Every worm in your soil is a tiny, continuously operating fertilizer factory and tilling machine. And their tunnels open channels that let air and water penetrate deep, breaking up compaction without you ever lifting a spade. This is why a square foot of soil that holds 1,000 worms is worth more than any bag of fertilizer. The worms are not a sign of good soil, they are the cause of it. And by feeding them in July, you are recruiting an unpaid workforce of thousands to rebuild your garden from below. What does this actually look like over a season? And what should you expect? In the first 2 to 3 weeks after you bury cardboard or scraps, you will see the gathering begin. Lift the edge of a cardboard sheet and the underside will be dark, damp, and already dotted with worms and the pale pinkish young ones that signal breeding. By 6 weeks, the patch directly under and around your buried material will be transformed. The soil noticeably darker, looser, crumblier, threaded with worm tunnels and studded with castings, and the worm population concentrated. There will be many times what the surrounding bare soil holds. By the end of the summer, if you have kept feeding through trenches or a tower, that concentration spreads outward, the worms radiating from your feeding stations into the wider bed, dragging fertility with them. And here is the part that pays off the following year. All of that worm activity, all those castings, all that organic matter pulled down into the soil, and all those tunnels opened up is structural soil improvement that does not wash away over winter. You go into next spring with soil that is darker, softer, more moisture retentive, more fertile, and more alive than it was. And the plants you set into it grow with a vigor that genuinely startles people who have only ever gardened in dead dirt. I have watched neighbors stand over a bed I got this way and ask what I bought. And the honest answer is nothing. I buried garbage and let the worms do the work. Let me give you the simple system that pulls all of this together so you can start this week and keep it running with almost no effort. Pick the hottest, driest, most lifeless-looking bed you have, the one where the fork bounces. Step 1, surface. Lay a mulch over it, wood chips if you can get them. Otherwise, straw or shredded leaves, several inches thick, to cool and shade the soil and hold moisture, because no worm strategy works in bone-dry, sun-baked ground. Step 2, shelter. Soak a few pieces of plain cardboard and lay them under the mulch or just under an inch of soil to create instant worm habitat. Step 3, feed. Dig a small scrap trench at one end of the bed and bury your kitchen scraps. Then move the trench a foot along each time you have a new bucket of scraps, walking it down the bed over the weeks. Step 4, anchor. Sink a worm tower into the middle of the bed and top it up weekly so there is always a permanent feeding station drawing worms. Step 5, water. Keep the whole thing damp, not soaked, just consistently moist because moisture is the one non-negotiable. The difference between a thriving colony and a dormant, empty bed. That is the entire system. Mulch, cardboard, a wandering scrap trench, a worm tower, and water. 5 simple moves, almost no cost, 15 minutes a week, and by autumn you'll be standing over the richest soil in your garden, wondering why you ever paid for the stuff in bags. So, here is what I want you to do today, before the season slips any further. Walk out to that hard, pale, lifeless bed, the one you have half given up on, and break down a cardboard box. Soak it in a bucket while you mulch the bed. Then lay the wet cardboard down, bury a handful of this morning's vegetable peelings in a shallow trench at the edge. Water the whole thing in and mark the date. Do nothing else but keep it damp. And in about 6 weeks on a quiet morning, go back out with a fork, slide it gently under that cardboard, and lift. I promise you the moment you see what is living under there, that dark, slick, seething square foot of worms and soil that smells like a forest floor in a part of your garden that was dead 2 months ago, you will feel exactly what I felt sitting back on my heels in the dirt that July morning, laughing because you summoned thousands of living soil builders out of the ground for free just by knowing how to ring the dinner bell. Start today. The worms are already down there, waiting. And all they've ever needed from you was a reason to come back up. If this story changes the way you look at the waste in your kitchen and the cardboard in your garage, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. We are uncovering the natural history and gardening secrets that have been overlooked for too long. Let's cultivate the future together. The next treasure of the earth will be revealed soon.